What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
My stepmom screamed in my face on New Year's Day, called me ungrateful and toxic, and told me to get the hell out of her house. I didn't argue. I didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't even slam the door. I just picked up my bag, grabbed my coat, walked out, and smiled because for the first time in a very long time, I felt more free than afraid. That night, I went home, sat on my couch in silence, and opened up the login to the family phone plan, the one I'd been paying for since 2016, even though I was the only one who never seemed to have anything to say in the group chats. I hovered my mouse over the Manage Lines button, took a slow sip of wine, and whispered to myself, no more second chances. Then I started clicking. One by one. By midnight, Darlene's line was gone. My dad's? Gone. Brian's? Bye. The next morning, they all woke up to silence. And me? I didn't wake up angry. I woke up done. But if you're wondering how it got to that point, how a woman like me, who always avoided drama, who paid bills on time, who sent Christmas cards even when no one replied, ended up cutting off her entire family with one cold click, then let me tell you what really happened on that last New Year's Day, because trust me, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of build-up, one quiet betrayal after another, until the most logical thing I could do was simply walk away and shut it all off. So let me ask you, if someone spent years treating you like a background character in your own life, would you walk away with grace, or would you make sure the silence actually echoed? The morning of New Year's Day, I woke up early in the guest room of my father's house, a house that hadn't felt like home since the year my mother died and Darlene moved in with her too big furniture and too small heart. I lay there under that stiff quilt she always pulled too tight when making the bed, staring at the popcorn ceiling, already counting down the hours until I could politely make an excuse and leave. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional creak of winter wood shifting under pressure. That house always made noise when it was pretending to be calm. It was never truly calm when she was in it. By the time I walked into the kitchen, Darlene was already halfway through a mug of coffee, sitting at the breakfast table in that old pink robe she'd worn for at least 15 years. My dad sat across from her, quiet as always, fiddling with the sugar bowl like it was some kind of nervous tic. No one said, "Happy New Year." No one even looked at me when I walked in, except the dog, and even he looked like he knew not to make too much eye contact before breakfast. I poured myself some coffee and sat down in the third chair. Darlene finally glanced up and said, "You could have helped clean last night. Brian and Teresa were in the kitchen for hours. You just disappeared." Now, for context, I didn't disappear. I went to bed at 1:15 after loading the dishwasher and sweeping up confetti that Brian and his girlfriend spilled after getting drunk and reenacting a TikTok they saw. Darlene saw me do it. She was sitting right there. But acknowledging that would have cost her the opportunity to get in her first jab of the day. I didn't respond. I never did, not first. She went on. "And I guess we can't expect a thank you either, huh? For the food, the hosting, the effort we put in." I looked up and met her eyes. Calm, measured, not a hint of emotion. I said, "Thank you for dinner. It was nice." She snorted. "Nice. Well, that just warms my heart." And then she started. The same monologue I'd heard versions of since I was 17 and didn't want to join in on Sunday brunches. She told me I was distant, selfish, hard to love, always judging others while refusing to look in the mirror. She said I acted like the world owed me something because my mother died young, as if I thought grief gave me a license to be cold. My father didn't interrupt. He never did. He just stared at his sugar bowl, spinning the spoon slowly like it might turn back time. Then she said the line that changed everything. She looked me square in the face and said, "Your mother would be ashamed of the woman you've become." Now listen. I'm not the type to cry easily. And I don't hold grudges, I file them. I store them neatly in emotional cabinets, and I pull them out only when I need to remind myself why I stopped trying. But in that moment, something broke loose in me. Not tears. Not rage. Just a clean, surgical detachment. I stood up. Took one last sip of the coffee that now tasted bitter. I said, "You're right. This isn't working." She blinked, surprised. I never agreed with her, not out loud. She said, "So what? You're leaving?" Again? I nodded. "Yeah, for good this time." She raised her voice. "You're ungrateful and toxic, Maggie. You poison every room you're in. That's why no one wants to deal with you." And I wish I could tell you I yelled something clever back. That I gave her a speech so devastating it would echo in her bones. But I didn't. I just picked up my bag, nodded to my father, who still didn't meet my eyes, and walked out the front door. The cold air felt like a slap I deserved. Later that evening, back in my small apartment 2 towns over, I sat on my couch with the lights low and the TV playing something I didn't really hear. My phone buzzed a couple of times. Missed calls from Dad. A text from Brian. "Way to ruin the holiday, sis." I didn't reply. I opened up my laptop and logged into the Verizon Family Plan account. 9 years. That's how long I'd been paying for everyone's phones. It started small, Dad's phone when he retired and said he couldn't keep up with the bill. Then Darlene's. Then Brian's when he got laid off. No one ever paid me back. No one even asked. It became expected. Just like everything else. But that night, I remembered that account was mine. My name, my card, my rules. So I opened the Lines and Devices tab and I started clicking. Darlene's line? Suspend service. Brian's? Suspend service. My dad's? I hovered over it for a long moment. Then clicked confirm. The screen flashed. Service changes will take effect immediately. I shut my laptop, turned my phone to Do Not Disturb, and let the silence finally begin. And I slept better than I had in years. It's strange how silence can feel louder than shouting when you've spent years being spoken over, dismissed with a condescending smile, and made to feel like your presence was something to be tolerated rather than cherished, especially by the very people who were supposed to be your family. That morning, after I pulled the plug on the family phone plan, after I clicked those buttons with a clarity and finality I hadn't felt in a decade, I woke up to nothing but stillness. No buzzes, no notifications, no guilt-inducing messages from my stepbrother calling me dramatic or selfish, and certainly no half-hearted voicemails from my father apologizing on Darlene's behalf without ever really saying the words. The air felt different, like I'd finally opened a window in a room that had been closed off and moldy for years, and for once, I wasn't choking on it. It didn't start with New Year's Day, not really. That moment was just the snap of the last, tired thread in a long, unraveling web of obligation and manipulation that had wrapped itself around me ever since my mother died when I was 17 and Darlene stepped into our lives with her smug superiority and constant need to dominate every conversation, every decision, and eventually every dollar. After the funeral, when people stopped bringing casseroles and calling to check in, my father folded inward. He wasn't cruel, just exhausted, broken in a way that never fully healed, and too quick to lean on anyone who seemed like they had a plan. Darlene had a plan. She always had a plan. And it started with convincing him that grieving was something to be packed away in a neat little box, shelved politely, and replaced with moving on. She moved in less than a year later, bringing with her a teenage son named Brian, who, unlike me, was loud, confident, and immediately adored. Darlene made it clear, without ever needing to say it directly, that her priority was to blend the family, meaning I needed to adapt, lower my expectations, and most of all, not make things harder than they already were. In other words, stop bringing up my mom, stop asking for space, stop being a problem. At first, I tried to cooperate because what else could I do? I was just a high school kid trying not to drown in grief, trying to pretend it didn't hurt to see my dad laugh harder at Darlene's dry jokes than he ever did at my mom's warm ones, trying not to flinch every time Darlene corrected me at dinner like a substitute teacher who resented even being there. But as the years went on and I moved out, went to college, got my degree in information security, and built a decent remote career, the pattern didn't change, it evolved. I was still expected to show up, keep quiet, and contribute. The phone plan came up casually one Thanksgiving. Dad had just retired and mentioned how expensive their monthly bills were. Darlene, always the martyr, sighed and muttered something about how we all have to tighten our belts now. I said nothing, just nodded sympathetically, until she looked across the table and said, "You work in tech. Don't you have some kind of discount or something?" I did. And even though it wasn't a big one, I offered to check it out. That turned into me adding them to my plan, just temporarily, which, like everything with Darlene, became permanent without discussion. Brian joined the plan a few months later after he got fired for skipping too many shifts at some warehouse job and needed to rebuild, which apparently required the latest iPhone, unlimited data, and zero accountability. For the next 9 years, I paid that bill every single month. I watched it rise slowly, like a tide no one else noticed, because they weren't the ones standing knee-deep in it. I never got a thank you, not a real one. Darlene would occasionally toss out a sarcastic, "We sure are lucky to have our family IT department," but she never meant it as gratitude. It was always a reminder. You're useful. That's your role. Don't confuse it with being loved. After the blow-up on New Year's morning, I didn't go back home to cry or vent to a friend. I didn't call anyone, not because I didn't have people I trusted, but because I didn't want to dilute the clarity that had just cracked open inside me like sunlight cutting through stained glass. I sat alone with a blanket over my legs and opened my laptop, pulled up the Verizon portal, and just stared at the screen. There they were, every line, every device, every name. Each one with its own number, its own data usage, its own little claim to a piece of me. I started with Brian. He was easy. He hadn't even messaged me on New Year's. Not that I expected him to, but the silence was confirmation that I was more of a utility to him than a sister. I clicked suspend service, and when the confirmation prompt appeared, I didn't hesitate. The second was Darlene's. That one felt like slicing through a knot that had been choking me for years. No warning, no passive-aggressive commentary. Just one click, and it was done. I paused at my dad's number. It felt different. Not because he'd been a good father, he hadn't, not for a long time, but because I remembered who he was before Darlene's influence reduced him to someone who avoided confrontation like it was a contagious disease. There was a version of him, years ago, who used to rub my back when I had nightmares and show up at every science fair with flowers. That version of him died around the same time Mom did, but the ghost of it lingered. Still, I hovered for a full minute before I finally clicked. Not out of spite, but out of acceptance. He had chosen silence for too long. Now he could have all of it. When I shut the laptop, I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clean. Like I had finally stepped out of a costume I'd been forced to wear for so long. I forgot what my own skin felt like. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was mine. The next morning, I woke up late, made coffee, and sat on the balcony wrapped in a hoodie while cold air bit at my face. My phone remained blissfully quiet until, around 10:30, it buzzed, not with a call, but with a knock. I opened the door to find Brian standing there, arms crossed, face tight with anger, phone in hand. "What the hell did you do?" he asked, waving the useless phone like it was a dead limb. And I smiled, not cruelly, not smugly, just knowingly. "I fixed the bill," I said, and stepped aside, not to let him in, but to let the moment hang heavy between us. He didn't understand it yet, but he would. Standing in my doorway that cold January morning, with his shoulders hunched forward and his phone dangling limply in one hand like it had betrayed him, Brian looked less like the smug, overconfident golden boy that Darlene had so carefully groomed to believe he could do no wrong, and more like a child who had just been told there were no more second chances. His face was pale, not just from the wind, but from confusion, maybe even fear, and as I stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe with a coffee mug in my hand and no intention of inviting him in, I saw for the first time just how unprepared he was for a world where people didn't clean up his messes without being asked, where family ties didn't mean lifetime support, and where silence wasn't just a break between arguments, but a decision. He stepped forward, as if proximity might help him make sense of what just happened, and his voice, sharper than usual, but hollow underneath, cracked through the morning air. "Did you seriously cut us off? You couldn't even give a warning? You just killed our phones." His tone dripped with entitlement, but it was shaky, as though he'd never actually had to ask anyone for anything before. Not without Darlene backing him up from the sidelines like a coach with a whistle and a list of excuses. I didn't reply right away. I let the question float there between us, watching how uncomfortable he was with the stillness. How quickly his confidence was unraveling now that he couldn't just text his way through it or throw my name into the group chat to be dissected and dismissed by the family tribunal. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering, not because I needed the caffeine, but because I wanted the moment to stretch, just long enough for the weight of my choice to start sinking into his bones. "Brian," I said, finally, with a calmness that made him flinch more than yelling ever could, "you've been on my phone plan for 8 years. 8. I've paid every bill, every upgrade, every late fee when you forgot your portion and promised to make it up next month. You've had plenty of warning. You just didn't listen." He scoffed, shaking his head like I was being irrational, like I'd overreacted to something minor, like cutting off 3 fully grown adults who never paid a cent for their own phones was somehow the equivalent of starting a war. "It's just a damn phone plan," he said, louder now, like volume could compensate for lack of moral ground. "You could have at least talked to us before making a decision that affects the whole family." That word, family, made something tighten in my chest, but not out of guilt. It was the kind of tightening you feel when someone lies to your face and expects you to thank them for it. Because that word had been weaponized in our house, turned into a chain that only ever pulled one direction. Family meant obligation when I was footing the bill, but silence when I needed support. It meant forgiveness when they wanted something, but judgment when I set boundaries. So I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was all just so painfully predictable. "Family?" I repeated, eyebrows raised. "You mean the same family that watched Darlene call me toxic, ungrateful, a burden, and didn't say a single thing to stop her? The one that let me walk out the door on New Year's Day like a stray dog no one wanted to claim? That family?" Brian's eyes darted, like he was searching for some part of the script that might still apply, but it wasn't there. The part where I backed down, where I softened and offered to fix everything again, that part had been cut. Permanently. "You know Dad didn't mean for it to get this far," he muttered, eyes dropping for the first time, and that's when I realized he wasn't angry because he couldn't call his friends or check his Instagram. He was angry because he'd never imagined a version of me that didn't bend. I crossed my arms, my voice even but firm. Then maybe Dad should have spoken up when she tore me apart in front of him. Maybe he should have stopped letting her run the house like it was hers alone. Maybe he should have acted like I was his daughter instead of just someone who kept the Wi-Fi working and the bills paid. Brian's mouth opened like he wanted to argue, but no words came out. He had nothing. For once, he was empty. And I could see it, how completely unprepared he was for accountability, how foreign the concept felt in his mouth. He had never had to earn anything the hard way, never been cut off, never been forced to consider that the people you step on might one day decide they're done lying down. I watched him process all of that in real time, the gears in his mind turning so slowly it was almost painful, and just as he stepped back, retreating to the hallway like a boxer finally realizing he's outmatched, I added one more thing, something he wouldn't understand until much later. "Oh, and by the way," I said, my voice casual, like I was mentioning a weather update, "you might want to check your LinkedIn. I removed myself as a reference on your last 2 job applications." His head snapped up, eyes wide. "What the hell? Why would you?" I shrugged, cutting him off with a calm finality. "Because I'm not responsible for keeping you afloat anymore. None of you. If you want a phone, get a job. If you want support, earn it. If you want a sister, act like a brother." He stared at me, lips pressed together, fists clenched like a toddler denied a toy, and for a moment, I wondered if he'd actually say something human, something real. But he didn't. He just turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath that I didn't bother catching. I closed the door slowly, not slamming it, not locking it in some symbolic gesture, but just closing it like you would any door that no longer leads somewhere worth going. Back inside, I let the silence settle again. I made another cup of coffee, opened my laptop to check emails, and felt the odd sensation of peace stretch itself out across the room like a cat in the sun. It wasn't revenge, not really. It was balance. It was control. It was the first time in years that I felt like I wasn't carrying everyone else's weight on my back just because they expected me to be strong enough to handle it. Later that night, just before I powered down for the evening, my phone buzzed. A single message from an unknown number. It read, "Hey, this is Teresa. We need to talk. Check your dad's voicemail." I stared at the message for a long time, the name pulling up a dusty memory of wine-stained holiday napkins and sharp-tongued whispers from the corner of the kitchen. Darlene's sister. A wild card. A gossip. But not a liar. I opened my laptop again, heart suddenly heavier, fingers moving faster than I expected. Because if there was one thing I knew about Teresa, it was that she never reached out unless something was already on fire. And she always knew where the bodies were buried. There are moments in life when silence doesn't just surround you but seems to crawl inside your skin, pushing against your ribs and tightening your chest like it's trying to say, "Pay attention, this matters." And when I read that message from Teresa, Darlene's sister, of all people, someone who usually treated me like I was invisible unless there was gossip to be milked from my existence, I knew instantly that something had shifted beneath the surface, something that had been waiting patiently, festering in the background like a leak behind drywall, subtle but destructive, and now it was seeping through. For a few long minutes, I simply sat there, the glow of my laptop screen painting pale light across my living room walls, my fingers hovering above the keyboard as I reread the message with a growing sense of unease. Not panic exactly, but the kind of creeping tension that tells you the next step you take might lead you somewhere you can't come back from. The idea of accessing my father's voicemail might seem invasive to someone unfamiliar with the context, but the truth was, I had set up that voicemail system myself years ago when my dad, who was increasingly forgetful even back then, had locked himself out of the service 3 times in a row, and Darlene had complained for weeks that he was missing calls from the bank, from the doctor, from God knows who, and I, as usual, had stepped in to fix it. I created a custom PIN, recorded the default greeting, and even linked a backup retrieval email that, unbeknownst to either of them, was my own. At the time, it felt like an act of care, maybe even love, or at least some echo of the daughterly responsibility I kept trying to fulfill even when it never seemed to be acknowledged. Now, years later, that small act of digital maintenance had become a doorway into something deeper, something I suspected would either confirm everything I feared about my place in that family or force me to rethink the way I'd carried that weight all these years. I opened the login portal, entered the credentials, and waited for the audio files to populate. Most of them were exactly what I expected: reminders from doctors' offices, automated pharmacy notices, the occasional robocall from a charity or political campaign. But buried between those dull bits of routine noise was a message dated 5 days before New Year's. The caller ID was masked, but the transcription showed enough to catch my breath. Maggie, Burden. Ray still feels guilty. My stomach clenched as I clicked the play button, already bracing myself for what I knew I wasn't going to like. The voice that filled my ears was unmistakably Darlene's, clipped, rehearsed, and laced with the condescension she reserved for conversations where she thought no one was listening who mattered. She wasn't talking to my father. She was talking to Teresa. I told Ray, I said it flat out, "She's a burden, Teresa. Always has been. She doesn't give back, she just takes." And he keeps clinging to this guilt, like raising her after that woman died was some kind of sacred mission. I'm sorry, but at some point, enough is enough. She's 34, for God's sake, and still acting like we owe her something because her mother passed too soon. I told him, one of these days, he's going to have to choose between peace in this house or carrying her dead mother's ghost around his neck. I don't remember breathing while I listened to it. I don't remember blinking. I sat frozen, every part of my body tightened by a kind of quiet rage I didn't even know I was capable of anymore. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the complete lack of hesitation, the certainty with which she dismissed my entire existence as an inconvenience, a mistake she had tolerated long enough. There had always been an undercurrent of resentment in her presence, an edge to her voice when she said my name, but hearing it spelled out like that, in her own voice, stripped away the last shred of doubt I had about how she saw me, not as family. Not even as a person, but as a box my father forgot to take to the curb. The hardest part wasn't even what she said about me. It was what she revealed about him. My father. The man who had, once upon a time, carried me on his shoulders through county fairs, who had stitched my stuffed bear when it seemed split from love, who had promised, on more than one rainy night, that no matter what happened, I would always be his first priority. That man hadn't stood up for me. Not in that conversation. Not on New Year's Day. Not in years. And the weight of that realization was heavier than anything Darlene's voice could throw at me. I clicked off the message, closed the tab, and sat in the quiet for a while, my coffee long gone cold, my apartment darker now as the sun dipped below the skyline. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in a long time. There's a certain numbness that settles in after a lifetime of being sidelined, something that feels like resilience, but might just be emotional scar tissue. Still, there was a flicker of grief somewhere deep in my chest, a faint echo of the daughter I had tried to be and the father I had hoped he still was. And then the landline rang. Yes, an actual landline, one of the few Darlene insisted on keeping because cell phones are unreliable, and because she liked having something to slam down dramatically when ending a call. I didn't need caller ID to know who it was. I answered it anyway. Maggie, Darlene's voice barked through the receiver, already sharp with accusation. You had no right. Her tone was raw, not broken, not humbled, but furious in the way people get when their mask slips and they realize someone saw the truth beneath it. There was no greeting, no attempt to smooth things over. She was done pretending, and, honestly, so was I. No soul, I said, my voice flat, controlled, already halfway through the conversation in my mind. You had no soul. And now you've got no service. Seems fair. She tried to speak, to regain control of the exchange, but I had already pulled the phone away from my ear, reached over, and dropped it back into the cradle like it weighed nothing at all. Then I blocked every number I knew was tied to them, Brian's new work number, Darlene's landline, the old shared email my father still used for billing, and I did it not out of anger, but out of necessity. There comes a point when survival demands silence, when the only way to stop the bleeding is to cut off the limb that keeps dragging you back into the fire. Later that night, I dug through my closet, pulling down a battered cardboard box that had followed me through every move since college. Inside were a few faded photos, some legal paperwork, and one red folder labeled in my own handwriting, Emergency Account Transfers, Dad. The moment I touched it, I remembered everything. And I knew what had to come next. It's strange how certain documents, forgotten in a closet and buried beneath years of mental dust, can suddenly become louder than words, more intimate than photographs, and more unforgiving than any confrontation you ever had the courage to walk away from. When I opened that red folder marked Emergency Account Transfers, Dad, my hands were steadier than I expected. But my breath hitched in my throat like some part of me had known all along that the final act of this quiet rebellion would be played not with yelling or slammed doors, but with carefully typed routing numbers, dry legal language, and the kind of detachment that only comes after years of being slowly peeled away from the people who were supposed to protect you. The contents of the folder weren't complicated. A few notarized documents. Copies of old statements. A letter from the bank confirming my access as a secondary beneficiary on an account my father, and I had opened shortly after I turned 21, a small savings fund my mother had set up long before she got sick. Back when hope was still a currency in our house, and everything hadn't yet been stained by the kind of grief that clings to your skin like humidity in August. The account wasn't large. In fact, compared to the effort I'd poured into holding the fractured remnants of this family together for years, it was barely a token. But it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about intention. About finally pulling back a piece of myself from a past that had always felt like borrowed space, like I was just a guest in the life I was told to be grateful for. I sat at my desk for over an hour with that folder open beside me, the laptop in front of me, and the portal to the bank glowing cold and clean on the screen. There were two transfers I could make. One, the withdrawal of my share, clearly outlined in the co-ownership agreement. The second, something I considered for a full 20 minutes, was a full account closure. I could have drained every dollar and closed the door behind me with a kind of finality that would have made Darlene's voice crack when she found out. But I didn't. Because I didn't need revenge that loud. I just needed release. So I took my half, closed the laptop gently, and exhaled a breath that felt like it had been trapped in my chest since the first time Darlene rolled her eyes at me across a dinner table and my father said nothing. And then, like some cruel joke of timing, my phone buzzed with a notification. Not a call, not a text, but a voicemail alert, an unfamiliar number, out of state, no name attached. My first instinct was to ignore it, to throw the phone into the drawer and pretend like this wasn't happening, but some quiet part of me, a part that hadn't quite given up on the possibility of something real, pressed play. It was my father. His voice was weaker than I remembered, strained, like he was speaking through a tunnel, but it was undeniably him. The message was short. Just under 40 seconds. And yet, it landed harder than anything Darlene had ever screamed at me in her most venomous moment. I don't know if you'll even hear this, kiddo, but I wanted to try. I heard what happened. And I know I didn't stop it. I should have. I should have done a lot of things. I let you carry more than you should have, and I guess I told myself that was love, letting you be strong. But it wasn't. It was fear. I was afraid of losing what little I had left, and I let her. I let her make you feel like less. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. I still see you. I always did. I just didn't know how to say it. And then silence. Not a goodbye, not an apology. Just that space where words should have been, and a click. A 40-second whisper from a man who spent 15 years saying nothing, and suddenly found something to say when it was already too late to matter. I didn't cry. I didn't save the message. I didn't call him back. Instead, I stood in the kitchen, made a cup of tea, and watched the steam rise from the mug like smoke from a fire that had finally burned itself out. There are some things you mourn long before they're gone, and I realized in that moment that I had already buried my father years ago, not in the literal sense, but in the quiet, aching way you bury someone who's still alive but no longer chooses to show up for you in any way that counts. The next day, I boxed up the few remaining family artifacts I still owned, a birthday card from when I was 13 with my mother's handwriting, a photograph of my father holding me at the beach when I was 4, a necklace I hadn't worn in years because Darlene once called it childish, and I drove them to a storage unit I rented under a different name. I didn't throw them away because I'm not cruel, but I didn't want them near me either. Not anymore. And as I sat in my apartment that evening, the last sliver of sunlight casting long shadows across the floor, I pulled out the last thing I needed to let go of, a letter. A real one, handwritten, the kind that feels like a relic in the age of screens. It was from my dad, postmarked 3 days before the voicemail. The handwriting was shaky, like the words themselves didn't want to stay on the page, but I read it anyway. He wrote, "If you're reading this, then I probably didn't say enough out loud. I always wanted you to be proud of me, not the other way around. You were always the strongest person in the room, and I hope one day you'll understand that all the silence wasn't because you didn't matter. It was because I didn't think I did. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for everything." I folded the letter slowly, placed it in the sink, and lit a match. It didn't burn fast. It curled at the edges, reluctant to disappear, like it still had something to say. But eventually, it was ash. And I didn't feel guilt. I felt light. They say revenge is best served cold, but I never wanted revenge. I wanted peace. I wanted a life where I didn't have to be the version of myself that everyone else demanded, where I didn't have to perform gratitude for scraps of affection, where I didn't have to pay for connection with compliance. And in the end, that's exactly what I gave myself. I didn't write back. I didn't return the calls. I didn't go to the hospital when I heard, weeks later, through a distant cousin, that my father's health had taken a turn. Instead, I changed my number. I sold my apartment. I moved 3 states away. And sometimes, when I look out at the water from my new balcony, I think about how silence, real silence, the kind you choose, not the kind you're forced into, can be the most honest sound in the world. Let them wonder what happened. Let them tell their own stories. Let them think I disappeared out of spite. Because the truth is, I didn't disappear. I just stopped answering to a name that never really felt like mine.